This is Bearing Witness, a podcast committed to exposing hidden atrocities, confronting the darkest acts of violence, and demanding justice for victims whose voices were silenced. Today, we tell the harrowing story of Junko Furuta, a name that continues to haunt our collective conscience and represents profound failures in humanity and justice. The girl at the center of our first inquiry entered the world on 18th January 1971, the middle child in a modest but close-knit household on the outskirts of Tokyo. Junko Furuta excelled at Yashio Minami High School, held an after-school job at a plastic molding factory, and had just accepted an offer of full-time employment she planned to begin after graduation. Friends remembered her as disciplined, kind-hearted, and quietly ambitious. She saved her pay in neat envelopes, intent on funding a spring trip with classmates and easing her parents' expenses at a time when Japan's booming bubble economy masked widening social fissures. That careful thrift, the tidy uniform she pressed each night, and the handwritten goals she kept in her notebook tell us she expected, quite reasonably, to live a long, ordinary life. Her aspirations illuminate the human scale of what was lost. To understand how four teenage boys could abduct and brutalize such a visible, engaged student without swift intervention, we must glance at Japan in the late 1980s. The nation stood atop an asset price frenzy. Neon skylines and record exports fostered a popular myth of near-total public safety. Yet, juvenile delinquency had surged earlier in the decade, with police statistics recording spikes in violent assaults, paint-thinner abuse, and school bullying. Lawmakers responded by reaffirming a rehabilitative juvenile law that capped sentences and shielded offenders' identities, even in heinous cases. Violence against women, though widespread, remained shrouded in shame. Public discussion of sexual assault was muted. Domestic abuse lacked a legal definition, and institutional reflex still favored preserving communal harmony over spotlighting individual harm. These cultural and statutory blind spots formed the backdrop against which Junko's disappearance would unfold.
Content warning: sexual violence, torture, and extreme cruelty.
On the evening of November 25th, 1988, Junko bicycled home from work when Hiroshi Miyano, a 17-year-old known to local police, kicked her from the saddle. Feigning gallant concern, he offered to escort her, then forced her into a vacant warehouse and raped her, while boasting of Yakuza connections. Before dawn, he delivered her to a suburban house owned by the Minato family, where three accomplices, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, were waiting. They threatened to kill her parents should she attempt escape and compelled her to call home, claiming she had run away to live with friends. Thus began 44 days of captivity in a residential neighborhood whose thin walls could not wholly muffle screams. Schoolmates visited, neighbors noted late-night commotion, and Minato's parents saw the bruised teenager yet failed to summon aid. A pair of patrol officers did knock once, acting on an anonymous tip, but left after a brief conversation on the doorstep. Within that small upstairs room, Junko endured incessant gang rape, beatings with iron bars and bamboo sticks, burns from cigarette lighters and melted wax, starvation alternating with forced ingestion of alcohol and paint thinner, and humiliation designed to erase identity. As her injuries worsened, bones fractured, eardrums ruptured, limbs swollen beyond recognition, she begged her captors to end her life. Instead, they intensified their sadism until the night of 4th January 1989, when a final assault left her fatally wounded. Fearing murder charges, the boys stuffed her body into a drum, filled it with concrete, and abandoned it on reclaimed industrial land in Koto Ward. Discovery came only weeks later, precipitating arrests that would test the limits of Japan's juvenile system. The horror itself is almost indescribable, yet the larger indictment falls on the lattice of passivity surrounding the crime. Parents who suspected but preferred silence, peers intimidated by delinquent subculture, police constrained by procedure, and a society hesitant to confront gendered violence, all became, by degrees, enablers. Junko Furuta's ordeal is therefore not an isolated nightmare, but a case study in communal abdication, a reminder that the line between ordinary life and atrocity is pathetically thin when institutions and bystanders retreat from moral responsibility. Bearing witness to her story obliges us to interrogate similar complacencies wherever they persist, because the failure to intervene is itself a form of complicity. A single family dwelling in Saitama Prefecture became the scene of 44 days of unchecked torture, yet the street outside remained calm. The families next door continued their routines, and the slight figure of a 17-year-old girl disappeared from public notice with scarcely a ripple. When neighbors reported hearing screams, the Minato parents dismissed them as teenage quarrels. When 2 patrol officers arrived after an anonymous phone tip, they accepted the word of a boy with Yakuza pretensions that no young woman was inside. Only months later, when the concrete-filled drum was opened, did officialdom admit what had been taking place in plain sight. Such passivity by bystanders is not a footnote, but the essential precondition of atrocities. It illustrates how the moral burden shifts imperceptibly from individual perpetrators to entire communities whenever fear of inconvenience outweighs responsibility to act. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police, already struggling with a surge in youth crime, fell back on procedure instead of instinct, and a teenager's life was extinguished inside a house they had briefly visited. That patrol car door closing and driving away is the most chilling sound in this narrative, because it confirms how thin the veneer of societal protection can be. The failures did not end at the threshold of that home. They reached the courtroom. Japan's juvenile law, drafted in 1948 to prioritize rehabilitation over retribution, limited sentences for offenders under 20, and guaranteed anonymity, even in egregious cases. Thus, when Hiroshi Miyano and his accomplices were tried in 1990, prosecutors could not ask for capital punishment despite public fury, and the district court dispensed terms that many observers regarded as painfully light. 17 years for Miyano, 5 to 10 for Joe Ogura, 5 to 9 for Shinji Minato, and 5 to 7 for Yasushi Watanabe. Public protests and an appeal nudged Miyano's term to 20 years, the maximum short of life imprisonment, but the others served barely a decade before walking free, their names officially shielded until journalists published them in defiance of legal convention. Even sympathetic legal scholars conceded that the statutory ceiling, designed for youthful indiscretions, sat uneasily beside crimes of prolonged sadism and sexual torture. The paradox exposed by this trial was stark. A system built to safeguard adolescent potential became in practice a sanctuary for adolescent depravity. Criminologists still debate whether harsher sentences deter such violence, yet few dispute that a jurisprudence incapable of signaling moral condemnation corrodes public faith. Professor Hiroshi Itakura of Nihon University observed that under the Nagayama standard, Japan's informal rubric for capital cases, the death penalty rarely applies when there is a single victim, however savage the method. And he noted that the court doubted premeditation in Junko's murder. That doctrinal nuance sounded abstractly reasonable to legal professionals, but to ordinary citizens it read as a loophole that treated an orgy of cruelty as a lesser evil than calculated homicide. Psychologist Keiko Yazawa, speaking to NHK years later, argued that leniency reinforced the perpetrator's narcissistic grandiosity, and by extension emboldened a subculture of youth violence that already venerated toughness over empathy. Human rights advocates added a complementary indictment. The system's obsession with offender privacy rendered the victim doubly invisible, first in captivity, then in court. The lesson, they warned, is that secrecy in juvenile justice cannot coexist with genuine accountability when crimes transcend the ordinary scope of adolescence. The confluence of timid policing, neighborly indifference, and statutory paternalism produced a perfect storm in which evil flourished unimpeded. Each institution, acting within its own rules of caution, deferred decisive intervention. Together they delivered a result no one can defend. What remains is a question that nags at every listener. How many other Junko Furutas exist behind closed doors, sustained by our collective preference for silence? If bearing witness means anything, it means rejecting that silence, publicly, repeatedly, and with an insistence that every mechanism of law and community exist first to protect the vulnerable, not to coddle those who prey upon them. News of Junko Furuta's death spread slowly at first, suppressed by the anonymity provisions of the juvenile law. Yet once local reporters pieced the chronology together, the case shattered Japan's self-image as a nation largely immune to sadistic crime. Tabloids printed court transcripts in serialized form. NHK aired sober discussion panels on Yank South youth subcultures. Civic groups held candlelight vigils whose photographs traveled the wire services and landed on foreign front pages. By the mid-1990s, her name had become shorthand for unspeakable cruelty in Japanese popular culture, referenced in school bullying dramas, manga cautionary arcs, and true crime anthologies. On international bulletin boards of the early internet, the Furuta file circulated as one of the first viral cautionary tales of gendered violence, provoking English-language think pieces on the limits of Japan's rehabilitative ethos. The upshot at home was a wave of soul-searching about whether deference to youthful offenders had tipped into societal negligence, especially toward women and minors trapped in patriarchal blind spots. The National Police Agency commissioned studies on bystander apathy, while feminist lawyers linked the case to the broader problem of family and dating violence that Japanese law still defined, if at all, as a private matter. Policy reforms trickled rather than surged, yet Junko's ordeal remained an unspoken catalyst behind each incremental change. In 1999, the Diet adopted the Basic Law for a gender-equal society, declaring state responsibility to combat gender-based violence, and in 2001 it enacted Japan's first comprehensive domestic violence statute, authorizing protective orders and criminal penalties for abusers. Legislators cited soaring public anxiety over women's safety, a climate shaped in part by the Furuta debate, as a justification for shifting from harmony preservation to victim protection. Most pointedly, the juvenile law was revised in 2000. The maximum determinate prison term for minors rose from 10 to 15 years. Courts gained discretion to impose life sentences, and offenders as young as 14 could now be transferred to adult jurisdiction for brutal crimes. Criminologists observed that parliamentary testimony repeatedly invoked heinous cases of the previous decade, a thin veil for Furuta, and a handful of similar assaults. Yet the gaps remain glaring. A 2023 study on media disclosure rules notes that victims are still rendered invisible whenever offender privacy outweighs the public's right to scrutinize proceedings. Human rights advocates argue that this tension perpetuates the very silence that enabled Junko's captivity. Psychologist Keiko Yazawa warns that lenient plea bargains and minimal post-release supervision leave recidivism risks unaddressed, particularly for sexual sadism among youth. Meanwhile, grassroots groups such as Victim VoiceNet continue to lobby for statutory recognition of prolonged torture as an aggravating factor warranting life terms regardless of age. The cultural narrative has thus shifted from disbelief to an uneasy conviction that progress has been halting and conditional. Real justice for Junko would have begun with immediate rescue, proceeded to unmitigated public accountability for the perpetrators, and ended with a legal framework prioritizing the dignity of victims over the reputational comfort of communities. Contemporary statutes inch closer to that ideal. Restraining order mechanisms, survivor compensation funds, and expanded prosecutorial latitude now exist where none did in 1989. Still, had those tools been available and employed, Junko's abductors could have faced life imprisonment, and police responding to a midnight tip might have entered the Minato residence under domestic violence authority rather than knocking politely before withdrawing. Her parents, who relocated after the trial to escape notoriety, have seldom spoken publicly since the final sentencing. Friends say her mother keeps a photograph of Junko in the living room alcove and refuses television interviews, convinced that repeated retellings risk sensationalism. Yet the family did consent to a scholarship in her name, funding crisis hotline training for high school counselors, insisting that some practical good emerge from what they endured. Societies honor victims like Junko only when private mourning feeds public vigilance. That vigilance looks like teachers empowered to escalate suspicions without fear of bureaucratic rebuke, neighbors taught to treat screams as an emergency rather than an inconvenience, journalists free to disobey conventions that erase victims while coddling offenders, and legislators willing to revisit sentencing ceilings whenever lived reality exposes their inadequacy. Each retelling of Junko Furuta's ordeal must therefore end not in voyeuristic horror, but in a recommitment to act by funding shelters, tightening police procedures for missing adolescents, mandating trauma-informed training for investigators, and amplifying victim voices in court reform debates. Our obligation to bear witness is fulfilled only when the next endangered teenager finds a door that opens, a bystander who intervenes, and a justice system that answers cruelty with something more persuasive than silence. The only safeguard against a future shaped by similar horrors is an informed and active public. If Junko Furuta's story moves you to refuse complacency, take the next step. Visit www.bearingwitness.info examine the documents, share the cases, and lend your voice where silence once reigned. This work demands time, painstaking research, and the moral courage to confront evidence most would prefer to ignore. It can continue only with the help of those who understand that bearing witness is a collective responsibility. Your donation, no matter the size, directly supports new investigations, expert interviews, and the preservation of victims' testimonies. Every contribution makes a difference, not as charity, but as an investment in a society that refuses to look away. Join us, support our mission, and help ensure that the next cry for help is met with intervention instead of indifference.